Yes, hello, good morning. Welcome at Berlinale Talents. It's great that you're all here to this first public session in House 3. It's great because we finally kick off and we finally start, which means a lot for us, so it's great that you're all here. And it's a very nice session because, first of all, it's in cooperation and supported with our partners ARRI, so thanks for being here. And it is a session which is kind of a revival because this survival guide has been a session over the course of the last years, always with a slightly different focus. Today it's survival guide, endangered images. And it is a revival because we're having on stage Dirk Meyer, colorist and post-production consultant, who is not just that, but also a very close friend and a long-term collaborator of Berlinale Talents. And we're very proud to have you again here on stage.
Thank you for having me again.
But it's not just him, as you can see, there are three young men standing there. It's Nico Remus, post-production supervisor, and also not the first time for you here on stage, but the first time for you, Nicholas Goodwin, head of post-production at Constantin Film. We're very happy to have you here. And yes, your applause. And without much more from my side, I hope you leave this session with smoking heads, because this is the secret topic of this session, we will say. And yes, enjoy the session. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see maybe at the end we have also a very special guest here for you. Yeah, welcome. From my point, as Hella already mentioned, it's a little bit, cautious. It's a little bit of a nice revival. This survival guide session has been hosted in this stage a few times. Back then it was usually called the Survival Guide to Digital Workflows. Then for many reasons it kind of fell over the cliff at some point, and there was no time, and there was time slot for it anymore. But in recent years, I thought about changing the topic a little bit and calling it something like the Survival Guide for the Digital Image, as I personally encountered in my position as a colorist, and sometimes helping productions in their image post, that these images are really under many different threats from very different enemies. Sometimes they feel like living creatures, even though it's just a technical device or some software tool. But this triggered the idea of actually assembling some of these pitfalls, as well as then the appropriate guidance or advice to maybe overcome these issues, these pitfalls, to help your images in the end also to survive up until the big screen. So I'm happy to share this with two people. Nico Remus, I've worked with him a few times before on actual productions, and we've been here talking about the Roy Andersson project 4 years ago, I think, or 4 years ago. Just a glimpse in a Roy Andersson production, a couple of years. And Nicholas Goodwin, sorry I don't have it here, but maybe you both also say a little bit about your background and why you're interested in this topic as well, apparently.
I'm a freelance post supervisor, and I do many different workshops for the very simple reason that I do see a lot of filmmakers, and I say filmmakers in general, it's producers, it's DPs, it's directors. I see a lot of filmmakers, people making films, struggling in the digital world, and especially in post, and it's so nice to see so many interested faces when we talk about post-production. And in post, quite often I hear this story, oh, post was a nightmare, and it was horrible, and we're so glad when it was over. And eventually what people are saying, they are the victim of their own post-production. And ideally, we understand enough and plan it well enough and budget it well enough to be not the victim, but the architecture of our post. Because there's a huge creative potential in post. And that's, to some extent, what we're here to talk about today, and that's what we always like to talk about when we talk about post-production during workshops.
Yeah, hi everybody. First of all, thanks very much for having me here this year. I basically work for a mainstream film producing company. We're also a release company. And I think that one of the most interesting things that we're up against in our business is telling stories, making sure that the photography, that the content gets to the right people in the right manner. And I think there are a lot of loopholes that we will encounter along the way. And for everybody who's starting in the business, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be kind of an adventure. And I think when we get down to the basics of making movies, it's always going to be a question of how well prepared I am. So I think that we'll probably have a little bit of a look at that today. And make sure that everything we do is going to be safely kept and well presented. Thanks.
One of our biggest struggles was actually to boil it down to a number of topics and advices in the end that we can share within these now left like 75 minutes with you. So we kind of have to jump from step to step somehow in between, but we try to make it comprehensible in a way that we follow a general production. But at this moment, I also would like to know actually who we're talking to and who's in the audience. So I would ask you, like, who of you is actually a director? So it's maybe, 40%, quite a lot. So who's a cinematographer? There should be a few. Okay, it's probably on par. Who's an editor? And of course, you're welcome to show up twice if you basically wear both hats. Okay, who's a producer? That's good, that's great. Who's a colorist? Okay, yes, some are a little shy. Okay, post-production supervisors? Cool. What else? Something I missed? Something someone is like, tell me? Yeah, what? No? Production designer. Oh, great. Fantastic. So, let me start with a question. What do you think in, let's say, the film industry is the one most important technical device? Shout it out. What do you think? Just from your stomach? Light meter? Camera. Have you seen WALL-E, Toy Story? Not really a physical camera involved in the computer-generated films. And also not really a physical light meter. Lens? Well, if you don't need the camera, what? A calculator. Or maybe the mobile phone of the production manager. The coffee machine at the production office. The typewriter of the screenwriter, maybe? But I think you can actually still do without that. But there's one thing you actually really cannot do. The screen. Yeah, you said it before, I just wanted to tease a bit more. Exactly. It's, I don't want to come into the philosophical point of, do films actually really exist if they can't be shown and seen? But think about it, if we don't have any, let's call them displays, there's not really any point in making movies or telling stories with images. And I find this quite important because I, as a colorist, have to deal with this a lot. Of course, I'm very concerned about calibrating my displays, my projection, to make sure that they adhere to certain standards. But then, at some point, that content will be seen on someone's tablet, phone, somewhere in a cinema, at home, and so on. So I think it's very important to stress that, or to remember that in the end, everything, like every single detail that you put into your film, into your images, on set as a production designer, in lighting, as a cinematographer, in framing, in costumes, makeup, in editing, and of course in color grading. In the end, this all is completely and absolutely dependent on how that particular display you're watching your film right now is, let's call it technically, rendering this image. Like, how does this actually convert those digital numbers into light again? And to give you a little bit of an idea how dependent we're also on our vision and on the circumstances, I assembled a few little things to talk about our vision. Not too long, I'll make it brief, but for this we have to kill all lights, please, Boris. So we start from an actual complete black, black screen, as black as it can get. This is as dark as this projection can go. So what kind of color would you call this? White. I think we can all agree. This looks pretty much white. But then if this is white, what is this? Whiter. I didn't change the dot in between. So how do you call this? But now, it's suddenly not really white anymore because we have something that is a little bit brighter, right? So then what is this? Super white. Why is that? Exactly. We sit in a complete dark, which is nice in cinemas. You basically define your own reference because there is not really another light source, so this becomes the brightest thing here right now. So this is what we understand and would always call like white. But then when we bring in another reference, something that is brighter, okay, so far. But then white, well, which one? What do you think is like the reference white? If you have to choose one, just quickly. Who's for this one? Okay, who's for the middle one? A little bit less. And who's for this one? No one really. Lawrence, what did you pick? Here talks a color scientist and colorist. So, to be honest, I don't really know myself, unless that yesterday I spent a few minutes and actually measured the screen a little bit. So I know that it's a lot brighter than a normal cinema screen would be, and that this one in the middle comes closest to what the reference in a given standard called Rec. 709, you might have heard of it, is actually defined as the white reference. It's called D65, so it's closely related to 6,500 Kelvin. And that is okay, within certain tolerances, I would say. But again, if I would show you only one of these, you would quickly adapt to it. Our vision just works very, very adaptively. Some of you might have seen this. It's just a very popular kind of illusion thing. So the question is, which one is darker, A or B? A is darker. Would anyone really, maybe you know, that's a quick trick question, but would you really consider that A is not darker than B? I wouldn't. Even though I know that when I place a little reference right next to it, I connect them, I take away that kind of break between, I can prove they are actually identical in terms of the gray level. But our brain always reads images. And we know that this is a checkerboard pattern, and actually A belongs to the darker ones, right? But with the help of this little cylinder there, casting a shadow onto this patch, it is suddenly darker and actually the same level. You can do this also with colors. So would you actually believe that this piece, the two center cross pieces, are, again, gray? And it doesn't, even if I tell you it is, and I will show you, you can't force your mind really to read it like this. You just think, no, this is yellowish because there's so much blue around. You kind of counterbalance. Your vision adapts for that and discounts for the blue and makes this yellow. But when you actually take away more and more of that surrounding color, suddenly it is just gray. And to give you a real-world image, kind of, also quite famous, there's actually not a single red pixel in this image. To prove that, because I couldn't believe myself, I took a really small part of it, I enlarged it really quite. You can see that there is still a little bit of cyan. Here feels a bit more reddish. And I measured this pixel, and these are the RGB code values in 8-bit, proving that actually even that pixel is a little less red, then it's green, then it's blue. Okay, so far. One last thing, and I'll give you the links where you can find tons of these illusions if you're interested. To talk about color blindness, which I would actually say it's a wrong term, because people being so-called colorblind, they see those colors, but in a different way. It's not that if they cannot discriminate certain colors, that it would be black for them. So color vision deficiency might be a better term. Does anyone know in here that he or she is colorblind? Can you, or is anyone there who cannot read or see a 71 in there? Is there anyone who cannot also see a 71 in there? Because you should be able to tell a little difference in those green colors here, that part, which makes this actually a 1, and if you are suffering from a red-green deficiency, then, and actually 5%, around 5% of males in Europe are red-green deficient, then you would see here a 21, so you would actually read this as a 21 instead of a 74. So far, to blast your trust in your own vision, if you want to, you can take a picture of this. If you want to go deeper into these kind of optical illusions, if you're interested. You're not allowed to take a picture of the following slide. Done, okay, quickly. Which I would ask you, without the help of your phones, to memorize. And then at the end, we'll come back to this. So try to memorize how this looks. While I tell you this is not a fancy Instagram filter or a 3D lookup table that I bought for 600 euros on the internet. This is actually shot analog with a Kodak Elitchrome reel that sat in the back of my old photo camera for about 13 years after it expired. So it just turned out like this, the scan. It's completely ungraded. So let's get into an actual film production. And for that, I hand over to Nico.
Yes, and maybe we bring the lights back on, just so everybody sees a little more, and we see you. So when we talk about production and making films, we usually refer to production. And if I put that in a timeline, we're looking at the shoot. Everything is geared up to the shoot. All the financing, all the script writing, all the preparation is done for the shoot. But to look at the entire timeline of a film, we actually need to look at this. Because only at the very end of this process, we actually have a film. After the shoot, we might have a bunch of files on a drive or on an LTO, or we used to have a bunch of film rolls in a can at the film lab. But we would not have a film, and we need to contemplate the entire thing to understand what's happening in the entire process. And making films is very complex, and we need to really look at everything, and we need to look at things from the very beginning to understand what needs to happen towards the end. And obviously, in this transition from shooting film and projecting film into shooting digitally and projecting digitally, we've also had quite a ways to go, and we've had quite a bit of mistakes to make to understand how it actually works. I see there's a huge potential in working digitally, and I also see a lot of pitfalls, what Dirk mentioned earlier. And I keep saying, especially in the digital world, the post starts before the shoot. And I used to talk about this as a concept and as an idea. Wouldn't it be great if we all talk about the post very early on? But this is a fact. The question is whether for you it is something that you anticipate actively or something that you allow to happen. Because again, in this timeline at the very beginning, a lot of decisions are being made. And either you make those decisions actively, or these decisions are made somehow by accident or by people who maybe should not make these decisions. We'll talk about these things a bit more when we continue, but that is a key concept to understand and to work with. And when we go into production, we obviously have the choice of many different cameras, and I like to be involved in the camera decision. I would never ever force one particular camera onto a DP, but I'd like to be involved in the discussion and like to know what we're getting, because again, I want to know what we have in the end. And I think this is just a selection of cameras, and all of these cameras have a right to be there, and there are different cameras for different projects. There's a great quote from the audio world where a mixer once said, "There are no bad microphones, but there are a lot of microphones in the wrong place." And the same thing is true for cameras. There might be a good purpose for each of these cameras, and we always have to look at every film and every project and every story individually to make that choice. Obviously, most people will actually choose an ARRI camera. I like that too, just because what they do looks good and it's so reliable, and both of these factors are so important. But so we'll continue with the ARRI camera, but I'll hand over to Dirk.
I'm also sometimes asked in the choice of cameras from DPs that I work with or worked with before. I guess that's also part of your job, that you speak with the cinematographers and consult them, or in a way.
Yeah, we actually, I mean, just picking up on what Nico said, I think that the most important thing about the choice of camera, I mean, there are a couple of things. Obviously, it's budget. You know, how much money do I have, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also being acquainted with the camera, knowing, you know, how it works. Very simple. I mean, there's just no time during principal photography to ask yourself, you know, what does this button do, right? So you want to make sure you've acquainted yourself with the camera. You want to make sure that you're doing your testing. We'll get into that as well. But I think that the whole idea behind camera choice, and then obviously as well, and perhaps even as important, choice of lenses, is where is this journey taking me? And what can I rely upon when I'm actually on the set shooting? So I think if we do get an opportunity to talk intensively or discuss the choice of camera in pre-production, it's usually what we usually end up doing in the end effect is perhaps even organizing one day shooting with the camera to see how it works, see if the lenses are the correct lenses, and how the camera reacts to certain lighting environments and so forth and so on. So it is basically for us kind of the first key question that we direct towards production.
And I'm always very happy to actually be involved in this as well, even as a freelance colorist, to come in and evaluate that footage that you gathered on a test shoot in a grading suite. But if we talk about cameras, and again, this could be any other camera, but happened to be that I found this nice image from this particular side of the camera, because I want to make one important point, that you have to distinguish between the front end and the back end. So if you do this, well, don't do this at home with your own Alexa. Don't want to get calls from ARRI service, people cutting their Alexa. This is kind of the sensor side where you capture the image. And then you have a recording side. And they basically, theoretically, are completely independent of each other, and you can have whatever recording going on in the end from whatever Alexa 65 or Venice or whatever camera. But they, of course, determine very much what kind of image you get in the end. And one important concept I want you to understand is that when we talk about the recording, there are file formats, but that still doesn't tell you anything. And I can quote people calling post houses, being asked, okay, what kind of files can you deliver us for the grading? And the producer saying, I think in that case it was a producer, yeah, here I got a bunch of a hard disk and there's a bunch of MOV files. Is that good enough? I don't know. I would say a file format is something like a container. It's actually just a simple box that comes in different colors, and it has a label on it, and it says maybe MOV. But whatever is in there, you don't really know unless you go inside and look at what kind of codec was used to create those images. Codecs, like coding, decoding, that's where it comes from. That determines the quality. It can be a certain size, it can be a really small size, it can be black and white, whatever. You don't know from outside when it just says, oh, this is a MOV. And this is far from being complete, and it's not to kind of irritate you. It's just a very short list of different file formats. Codecs with their subcodecs, like you all know, Apple ProRes, I guess. That's a codec family, actually, so you have even a lot more than these different variants of this codec. And they usually come in a MOV container. But in a MOV container, you can also have a compressed H.264 codec, which usually is not so good for post-processing. So think about this being separate, and also that you can, for specific purposes, determine or decide actually for this particular VFX shots, for instance, it makes sense to go and record ARRI RAW. But if you do this for the whole show, that comes with consequences compared to recording Apple ProRes, which is just a lighter file size and everything. And then I guess you agree that it's also a budget and a time thing, that someone on set has to handle this, and so on. Another thing that we kind of jump to from here, different codecs also store different, or in different cameras as well, store more or less metadata information. And one of the early threats in post-production is that you cannot really assemble your film in the end because you're missing really important metadata. What would you say is the most important of these? A time code, yes. And maybe a little bit more than just a time code? A reel, yeah. So to identify in the end every single frame. This is a complete list of metadata that is actually created by an Alexa camera and stored into the various containers. Again, it's just like, don't bother to read this, but these are, of course, the absolute minimums. An important factor is if they are all created, what happens with them? How do they live on when they are actually needed? And that's where we have to talk about workflows on set and starting maybe with how to actually create the data management on set and creating your backups.
We still call it backups for good reason. That's what we do. But it's actually, I think it's the wrong term. Because what we do all the time is we recycle the camera media. And one of the best ways to erase anything from a drive, from an SPIS card, from a flash drive, whatever, is to record new stuff on it. So all of this is being recycled, and we're making sure it's being erased, definitely. So I think we always have to be aware, once we recycle our cards, our backups is our only existing original. And that as a concept is a very important distinction to make. One of the things you should always do, and as a producer you should make sure there is somebody doing this. As a DP, you want to make sure nothing is lost, is to be working with checksums. And checksums is actually it's quite a simple protocol that compares what is on your original camera card with the backup you have written to whatever drive or RAID you're using. And then make multiple backups and store them in different locations. There is a rule that's kind of borrowed from photography that different production companies are working with, and actually even Netflix has adopted to this rule now. It's the 3-2-1 rule. And it's quite simple. You make 3 backups. You make them... Sorry?
Go on.
You use at least 2 different media. So you don't only use drive. Maybe you use a drive and an LTO. Also to separate that. And then you store one of these backups in a different location. So whatever happens to the place, you are safe with that. And it's also always good to check with the insurance company if your workflow is insured. Actually, all the insurance companies really like working in the digital way, because if you go through this protocol, actually losing files is very hard to do. And if you don't work like this, or if you deviate from the path of using checksums, you also lose your insurance coverage. So your images are endangered in terms of maybe losing footage, and it's also endangered in a way you will not get to reshoot if you don't use a proper backup procedure. We will have time for questions at the end, if that's okay.
So take that drive and store it somewhere else.
Yeah. And something else should happen at one point during the shoot. This is a shot from a DIT on set. And that's
a DP with
a DP with a DIT, sorry.
Yep.
It's Anthony Dotmental and Stefan Čupek. And they're QCing the footage on set. And that's something no software will do for you. You need to look at the stuff that you have created to make sure it's all okay. Make sure the camera is working okay. You make sure you have no issues in copying it, etc. Dirk, you want to continue on this?
Yeah, just some examples of actual damages that can happen. This happened in post, actually, transferring a file just via network. And network protocols usually have some kind of verification, but still, this happened after it was copied from kind of one server to another server in a post house. So it could be recopied and taken from the original one, and then it was okay. This is a very beautiful one. I thought I kept her in my library of QC issues. That is from a Red camera a couple of years ago. It was 1 or 2 frames within a clip. And that also could be solved by rereading from the original camera media again. There was some issue with the flash card, but then reading it again, it could be solved. But just as a kind of what can happen, things do happen. Files are getting corrupted, and proper copy and data workflows are just very advisable.
Let's talk about frame rates. Anybody have a particular choice for a frame rate, a favorite frame rate? Sorry? 120. To shoot or to project? I mean, obviously, there are many different frame rates out there that we can use. And they are also something that could be useful for a particular purpose. But the point is, this needs to be, again, a decision that's not just a decision by the DIT or the DP alone. Shooting in a particular frame rate is also connected to the delivery you need to make. And it's also always good to talk to a distributor or to understand, where's the film going? What are we working for? And all these have a reason. But you have to remember one thing. In the end, your film will have 1 frame rate. That's an issue that happens quite often, that people shoot different frame rates or different crews, especially when we're talking co-production and people are shooting in different countries. Suddenly you have one crew working in 24 and another crew working in 25. I had one project like this a couple of years ago. I'm not going to say who it was, but they said, they called me and said, okay, we have this issue, what do we do now? I said, well, why did you continue shooting in 25 when you started shooting in 24? And they said, well, the DP said it's okay because it's all digital. And that is very thin ice you're walking on if you do that. So you have to be aware, and you have to make that decision as a joint decision with everybody. Of course, you can shoot in 30 frames per second, and your images might look a bit more smoothly, but then effectively you have to transcode everything to 24 if you want to make a DCP, or you have to make it a slow motion. You have some more examples, Dirk?
It's a big topic. We gathered some examples to show, and this happened recently quite a lot, that people shoot a little higher frame rate to make it slow motion. Looks beautiful as long as you keep it slow motion. But then in editing, just a lot of times it happened that a decision was made that no, it should not be like slow motion anymore. And then you go from these sometimes very odd frame rates of 30, 32, 40 frames back to either 24 or 25, and that just never looks really good. To illustrate it, let me open a few clips. Can we dim the light for this? Oops, sorry, I have to place it on the other screen. To illustrate that, we took a 24 per second clip and basically stretched it into a timeline with 25. So you have this added 1 frame per second. So you think, yeah, but there must be fancy algorithms to solve this. So this is something called frame blending, where basically all the frames, all the 24 frames over 1 second are like blended on top in various levels to generate that 1 extra frame. But there must be something more fancy, right? So in Resolve, there's something called optical flow. That sounds crazy. That actually really calculates where every single pixel is moving from one frame to the other. But you want to see that again? Or was it clear? I've got a few. Frame grabs from this. Frame doubling, of course, gives you a sharp image as it can be, every single one, because there's nothing going on except one of them is doubled. If you go from 24 to 25, you need one more. But in motion, you saw that, well, then every second you've got this little stop moment, also called stop frame. Frame blending gives you these kind of double edges because two frames are layered on top of each other in various amounts. And this optical flow, or sometimes called motion estimation, tries to think about what can be the position of the pixel actually in between these two frames. But that comes with artifacts around very fast moving objects, like here, or if we look at these in full frame. So that is the original sharp frame. This is two of them superimposed. And this is the optical flow where you see, but here it's really not possible to create a sharp image. Also here things are going on. And here it kind of, here you got like two poles and there's just one. So which one would you choose? Yeah, you don't want to give an answer right now. But at some point, as Nico said, your film has to be delivered in one of these frame rates. And if there is a mismatch of frame rates, and you can't just, of course you say, yeah, but we can slow down from 24 to 25, or speed up from 25 to 24. But that's not really an option, sometimes for other reasons, when there's music involved. I don't know if you had those cases. So then you have to die one death at least. You have to choose. Kind of related to this is the question of aspect ratios. Maybe you want to share something in general about the choice of aspect ratios. We have, I guess, slightly different opinions as well.
I mean, aspect ratio is always going to be kind of also a creative decision. And I think you're more or less going to be, especially in theatrical point of view, you're going to be stuck with two variations, which would be flat and scope. How you shoot, you can kind of shoot basically over that aspect ratio and use the extra information to move the image if you need to. But in the end, it boils down to two theatrical images. On a television perspective, there's a little bit more flexibility. You have 178, which is kind of your 16 by 9, and also what you're finding these days a lot more is 2:1, which is an aspect ratio that some of the streaming networks are using more and more these days. But as I said, I think that the important thing is understanding from the first day of principal photography in what kind of an aspect ratio I am shooting for. And not leaving it only up to a decision that will be made in post-production.
The reason we chose the slides on the left is to also explain, in film history, there have been many, many different aspect ratios, actually many more than what we see here. When the first widescreen, the Cinerama, came out, you even needed 3 projectors to project a widescreen cinema image. And of everything that has been happening in the cinema, exactly 2 aspect ratios are remaining today, not more. And it's important to know that, what they are. And it's also important to understand, if you deviate from these standard aspect ratios, you're creating, again, something that may not be able to be played everywhere. And I always say, you can be unique in many ways, but I would not try to be unique in creating your own aspect ratio and then having a DCP that you cannot send around to all the festivals.
I kind of agree and disagree a little bit. I've just read very well-written or explanations for certain aspect ratios, and even in German television production, young student cinematographers convinced the broadcast station to go for a 2:1 aspect ratio. It can work, but the main thing here, again, with everything that we talk about, is making you aware of the consequences, the implications that this has. So I thought this example of 2:1 is maybe a good one to talk about, as I just recently had it on 2 productions. Because what do you decide then for? Let's get the numbers down here as well. This is the so-called full container. That is actually what a sensor in a projector, in a DCI, in a Digital Cinema Initiative, qualified, certified projector actually has in terms of the pixels. But within that, you're only allowed to have these two aspect ratios. And one is only using 858 pixels in height, and that creates, if you do the division, a 239:1 aspect ratio. And I believe, since we always talk about the x-axis first, like how wide the images are, this number should be also this way around, and unless we all really shoot just portrait mode, it should be 239:1 and not 1:239, just on a side note. So this is also called scope. And then there is this number, like almost 2000, with the full height of this, 1080, which we know is a number from full HD. And if you divide that, then you end up with 185, the long-term normal widescreen US-American standard. And that's called flat in DCI terminology. So you have to decide. So you were brave and decided to frame everything 2:1. So what do you do now? Has anyone done this? Has anyone shot 2:1 on a project? Only one? Okay. Or worked on a project that was 2:1? You remember this? No? Yeah? Do you know what they did in the end with the master? What did you decide for? What kind of container did you use? Do you remember? Okay, great. So we'll do that. And before that, this is HD, 1920, 1080. Because in the end, you always have to think about this as well, because if your film's going to be released in television or in a Blu-ray, you also have to squeeze everything in there again. So let's take what you just said, a 2:1 aspect ratio of a nice photo that Nico shot just around the corner. You see the German Technical Museum down there. So it could be this, or it could be that. What do you do? And you said you did scope. Okay. So let's do some math. Sorry for that, Monday morning. This is the width that you would end up, because it's actually twice this number, 2:1. So you end up with 1.5 million pixels. 1.5. If you do the same thing in the flat container, you actually end up with 2 million pixels. That's roughly 1/3 more in terms of actual pixels, actual image resolution. So I'm not sure if that was the best decision. We did tests as well for the other productions that I mentioned, and we, in the end, decided also for this one, checking it on the screen. Of course, the problem is more complex, as most things, because you also have to consider what is the majority of screens in cinemas. Are they scope or are they 185? Because depending on that, the zoom of the projector, they actually, or the lenses, they actually zoom and fill the screen and so on. So your image might be bigger when you go for scope, but that means also on a bigger image you actually have less pixels, like it becomes even more blurry.
The theatrical reality, basically, of it is any kind of DCI labeled theater, at least in this country, can do both. They can project both. I mean, they can do 239:1. We discussed this last night,
Yep.
or flat. And interestingly enough, there are a couple variations of that whole thing. I mean, some theaters have a screen, and if they decide to do a flat projection, they just basically open the cache. And if they do scope projection, they just close it again. So it's the screen itself is the same size. They just change the variation, basically, of what you're seeing through, the cache that they're driving up and down, or some, pull-in curtains from left and right. But the container themselves is what Dirk was getting at. Is basically boils down to two.
Let me ask a quick question to those who have done 2-to-1. I think there were two. Yes. Were you all aware of that you had to comply with an existing format with that aspect ratio up front, or was it something you found out while you actually had to do your mastering? It was clear in the beginning for you. Okay, good. Good. At least it's a process that's been thought through. You know, if you encounter these kind of issues only at the end, and then you realize, oh wow, we shot in an aspect ratio that does not exist in the cinema, you're in trouble. You know, discuss these things up front.
Obviously, except if you're shooting for television, you're in a different situation then.
Yeah. Next question for you then. Did you actually shoot a frame leader? Yeah? Great. Unfortunately, that tradition gets somehow lost because people think now we're dealing with digital sensors, photocells. It's a given fixed raster, so what can go wrong? But with the variety of choices of aspect ratios and maybe shooting more than you actually need in the end because of the sensor sizes and resolution, because of the various choices of anamorphic lenses, it actually, I feel, becomes more complex. And then it is still a good idea, and here comes my advice, to shoot proper frame leaders. Proper means maybe not like this. Not only that it's written wrong, but it's also, I think there was another label down here when they take away the slate, but is this the edge? I guess so. And then are these the edges there that they're talking about? Spend 5 more minutes.
It's what they call rock and roll, I think, when they're actually shooting.
I'm not sure about this, but it was fun to find. There's actually a shop, a t-shirt shop, like Film Crew t-shirts, something like that, where you can go and order t-shirts with a printed frame leader, different aspect ratios, 1:8:5 and so on. I would argue, it depends a little bit on who is actually wearing it, how precise it might be. You might encounter some kind of curvatures that are not really intended. Something like this. That's decent. This marks what is actually image content, what is also recorded, but in the end should be cropped. And that's easy to print, place on a wall, and shoot. Advice along that topic, you probably all know these kinds of test charts. They can be helpful. It's not a must to put them in every single shot and so on, but even just a gray card can be helpful in various lighting conditions when you mix certain cameras and you don't have time to properly test them before and you haven't used them and you have this drone camera and so on. Why not shoot a color checker? That might help in the end when you sit in color grading and try to match them. And just as a courtesy, because this guy, Charles Poynton, we not only have to thank him for coming up with the 1080 number and also that HD is actually using square pixels. But he also had the original idea with those white dots and then the circles around it. And this was actually shot just in December in front of the Kodak building in Rochester. This is a real-world use case for gray cards. There was a production Nico worked on.
Yeah, on that film, the DP wanted to shoot with a red camera, fine with me, and she wanted to shoot RAW, and I just suggested to shoot gray cards, and as I always suggested, I say, put it in the actual light, the actors, and what she did, in addition, she said, okay, I'm gonna put the gray card to the actual actor, so no matter what the actor was, she always made them sit still for a few seconds, put a gray card next to it. And that really helped in the end, in the process prior to the color grading, to get a neutral match of all the shots, or to actually know where we are, to have a reference that will tell us exactly where are we with the color and with the light in this shot. And that's a great example, and it actually hardly took any time during the set, because you do that You do it on every set, and ideally you do a full color checker now. But it really helped a lot.
Yeah, we have to rush already quite a bit. But the main, well, as you said, post-production starts before shooting. A lot of these topics and advices were actually focused on the production side. So when you start. So let's move into the next step, editing. And maybe think about, why do we still have something called an online workflow? Why and how do you actually create rushes? So maybe let's ask you again, what was on your last production, the workflow? Who was taking care of creating rushes for editing? And what did they look like? Yeah? Want to say an example?
Color grading facility which converted everything from log to rec, and also cropped the image so the director doesn't have to create ADs.
So it was actually also graded, or was it just one transfer?
First like did first
Okay.
before
Mm-hmm.
it moved to editing.
Mm-hmm. Someone using just like one transfer and doing it him or herself? Did that ever happen to anyone? No? So they were all properly graded by a DIT or colorist? Yes?
Did anybody ever work in log in editing because it was shot that way? I see it quite often. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Okay. Why?
Because the editor received the files that way.
The editor wanted to see the files in that way. We received, okay, yeah.
But was he receiving? Was he also receiving LUTs as well?
Yeah, but
So he was importing the LUTs basically with the log-C.
I had a very strong debate with her, and she said that her screen is too dark and she can't see the images. It's terrible, and since then I never let images go out in log.
Great. It's kind of full stop. It just should never happen, and there's no excuse. We probably can all share, and a lot of you share these experiences of something being edited in log, like these flat, low contrast, low saturated images, and the director/editor completely customizing to it, completely adopting and embracing it, falling in love with it, and in the grading, you're kind of always fighting against that. And it's hard to even just touch the contrast button a little bit. Yeah, been there, done that. Don't need it to happen again. So
We had a recent show, in fact, where the director, after he's finished editing, went to the grading suite and said, "I want it to look exactly like it did at the Evid." And the colorist was, but we're in a different color space here. We've got different opportunities. I don't care. I want it to look the same. It was like murky brown or something. And it was like not a nice image, but anything happens in that sense, and you always have to be, have some sort of a solution for that too. And what are the images that we get and see for the first time as producers? Or, when your shooting day is over, you want to see the stuff and you want to make sure that it looks good. So there has to be some sort of a color transfer in there somewhere. Otherwise, it just looks like crap, right? So I think that's kind of the whole point behind, making sure that what I see is going to be of a good nature.
These low log images, they are not meant to be seen on a broadcast monitor, full stop. It's just wrong. It's a wrong assumption to say, oh yeah, but then I can see what's in there and so on. Yes, that's not really your job as an editor. That's something that your DP is to take care in the beginning, that everything is there that they want to achieve in the end. So these images must be transformed, must be transcoded in a way that fits your viewing display. And that's usually something that adheres to the standard Rec. 709 that was done by some broadcast people so that it looks nice there. And that's just visualize the difference from that particular show, what the difference is. Some more comments about rushes?
Yes. obviously what we want to do when we do rushes, we want to make them look nice, and I just want to support the idea of creating something that looks, in terms of look, as close to the final image as possible. Because again, directors sitting in the editing room for months, seeing an image, we all get used to that. And in the end, when you go into the final grading, what people react to is not it's better or it's worse. What they react to is the fact that it's different. And if you present this log image or something close to a log image to a director and an editor and to screening versions, people get used to an image that's actually not intended that way. So when we do rushes, and we're using an example of a ProRes 4K file here, we are creating a smaller file for offline editing. And the purpose of that file is really to be moving fast and easy in an editing room, and to be a good reference for what you will have in the end. But it is an offline reference. Therefore, I still prefer to have time codes burned into the picture, in addition to having time codes in the files. That's how you can also tell this is really for offline editing. And in the end, when we're done editing, we have a rather complex timeline. And just looking at one timeline here from one feature film, you see there's a lot of cuts on there, and there's a lot of material that we then need to reconform to go back to the original material. And I've taken the example of taking a screenshot of an EDL, and this is every clip has a name and it has a number. Every clip has a time code, so we identify that. On a film I worked on last year, we had a shooting ratio of 45:1. Mathematically, that gives us a bit over 7 million frames. And technically, you can make a cut on every frame. So how do we identify those? Or imagine some of these go, I'm just picking one time code, some of these go to complete zero. And you have to find this frame amongst your 7 million frames. Or imagine all of this going to zero. And that's an important thing to keep, to take care of the metadata that you're importing into the Avid, and to take care of everything that happens along the way, so you can make a proper turnover into conforming. And because in the grading, you really want to access back to your original camera footage. You don't want to be accessing what you've had in the editing room.
Nico, can I just make a short suggestion to all the producers? Don't try to save money by not hiring an assistant editor. It'll just always end in a disaster. All right?
So from there we go, because you of course took care of a proper EDL, so we go into grading, everything's nicely conformed, and then you get your DP and director coming in, and they want to recreate what they have seen before, maybe during the rushes grading, maybe in another film, and because they know exactly how things looked back then, right? Can we kill the lights again, please? Because now I'm going to challenge you. Don't want to make it too easy, of course. So you're going to see 3 times the photograph I showed you in the beginning, which is actually my little daughter. But only one of them is the correct one. The other ones are slightly changed for whatever reason. Might be a miscalibration, a wrong transform. So you have to choose A, B, or C. Does that look like it did? Yes, no. I'll show you the others, and then I want your vote. Does that look like the others? Or maybe this one? Okay, I go through it. B, A. So who's for A? Who's for B? And who's for C? It's almost a third, and a third. Great. So before I give you the answer, here comes some advice, something that I've been teaching, especially my color grading students a lot, and that is using a digital test chart. That is my personal one. It's on my website. You can have it. Comes even with a PDF that explains a little bit what's going on here. But the important thing is, well, I'll show you. This actually has now the same transform, the same thing that goes on as on the photograph A. And even without knowing how this should look like, what can you see here? If you just look at the colors, there's something weird going on if you look at the highlights here. So there's a weird kind of color shifts, and that tells you, this somehow looks quite bluish. So in fact, version A is too blue. I made it a roughly 500 Kelvin bluer. So here comes version B. Oh, what's going on here if you look at those details? Did you notice that version B was actually slightly soft, like blurred? Here on the chart you can see right away. So that can't be the original either. Here comes C. Does that look correct? Assuming that this, of course, should be neutral gray, and these should be neutral gray rams. I guess you disagree, and maybe on top you might notice that there's something weird going on. You can see some banding here, and that's because there's a vignette on it. So yes, I cheated. None of them was correct. Of course, I know one person here that definitely knew, but it should look like this. And if you get yourself accustomed with how a test chart, a reference image, it can be a photograph that you really know very well, because skin tones are very helpful in this as well. If you assemble a set of images, test charts, photographs that you know very well, and you watch them on a calibrated 709 display, then you get yourself familiarized with how this should look on a 709 calibrated display. And then from there, whenever you encode something, you transcode something, you master and deliver something to somewhere else, you include these, then you can judge how it looks on a different display. So I include these in my exports from grading, and when the DP or director calls me, oh, I just watched the grading that I loved so much at home, and it looks really crappy. Then I can say, okay, can you describe at least, because it's always over the phone, you're supposed to judge images over the phone, of course, great. So, but then I can ask him to go to that test chart in the very beginning and explain to me, how does it look? Is there something weird going on there? Is the resolution going on? Does this look like really neutral and so on? Or is it maybe just your display that's wrong? It's just the only meaningful way to have something standardized, and it's so much easier to judge this on a test chart than on a graded image.
So many different types of possibilities to look at these things as well. You know, everybody's got a desktop computer or a laptop or an iPhone or an iPad or whatever, and everything looks differently. And so when, as like Dirk was saying, when the director calls and says, I don't know, the rushes look like, you know, they look terrible, then it's always, for people in post sometimes also always kind of a challenge to try and explain, or even the DP sometimes, to try and say, don't look at it on that display. Come in and have a look at it here in this other, you know, environment, and then judge, you know, make the judgment then.
I'm going to rush a little bit through the next topic, and that's introducing another test chart, just a gray ramp that allows me to tell you that it's okay, but you can see quite a lot of steps here in between, like banding. Do you know what bit depth means? So you might have heard about the different file formats, and that something you record in camera has like 10-bit, 8-bit, 12-bit, 16-bit, and so on. And it sounds like, okay, the difference between 10 and 12-bit, that's not too much. But what we're talking about is the amount of shades of colors that are actually being captured or from the camera side and then encoded into the whatever format you chose to record to. So if this is a ProRes 444 that can be written, for instance, in an Alexa camera, that comes with 12 bits, and that gives you 4,000 different shades of gray. So for red, green, and blue, you end up like having 4,000 times 4,000 times 4,000, many different colors. That's huge, that's great. But that also creates maybe a lot of data, so let's do a compromise, let's go to 10-bit. There are many codecs that actually use 10-bit. What do you think? Where is 10-bit here?
It's only 2 bits less, so it can't be that much, right?
Half?
It's a trick.
Those who know, of course, yes, actually, it's only there. Because with every bit, the amount of shades doubles or halves, so from 12 to 10, it's like half for 11 bits and then half again for 10 bits. So that is huge, especially considering that in broadcast and in consumer cameras, in DSLR cameras, and your phone, etc., when you shoot with that, they usually only do 8-bit. So how much is that? It's again only a quarter of that. So we're talking 250 shades of gray, or red, green, and blue. So that is quite significant in your choice of acquisition in the beginning, because you want to be able to manipulate in grading and also in visual effects as much as possible. And then in the very end, for distribution, actually, 8-bit is fine and has been fine, as long as it's done well. Speaking about visual effects, there's a little bit of a misconception about one term that I want to get straight. And that's the difference between log and linear. You might have heard about this, you might have used this, you might be aware that log is something we choose in camera to capture as much as possible. And then it feels like the opposite of it is lin. And in recent years, it has been used like this. So it's either this flat image, or it's a decent-looking image on a broadcast monitor. So one is log, one is lin, right? No. So very roughly, log uses a transfer function that does something like this curve, it lifts the mids. If you look at it on a broadcast monitor, it will look washed out, low saturated. You've seen this on set when you turn on the log view. So linear, on the other hand, is basically a straight line in transcoding from the image, what the image sensor captures, into the file. It's kind of a proportional transform. It's creating an image that would, when you would look at it on a broadcast monitor, looks actually very, very dark. So that's not what you see when you switch on television. And that would be rather called gamma encoded, or some people call it, this is video. So there's log, there's lin, and there's video. Okay, fair enough. But my main point is, in communication between grading and visual effects, this is what the visual effects departments kind of want to have. They work in linear, sometimes called linear light. And if they call for this and ask this, and you are supposed to render out some clips, and they say, I needed linear light in this OpenEXR container, and yes, Resolve for free does that. They don't want to have this, what you might think it's linear, the one thing that looks like Rec 709. If you turn on the lookup table, it turns to Rec 709. No, that's not what they want. They want this, and they might give you this back, and if you put then the wrong lookup table on, it does not work. So just in terms of terminology, I've been fighting hard in the last decade to make people aware what the difference is. But even more important is that with all VFX, and hands up if your last movie did not have any single VFX. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 100. So at some point, there will be done something outside of the grading in whatever application from whatever person. And then you get it back in grading, and you try to fit it in, put it on the timeline, apply your grading again, and it did happen quite a lot to me that something's wrong. It doesn't look like it should. Like the other take without the VFX shot, without the VFX work, it does not work. To avoid this, I recommend you to do a VFX loop test. That basically means you deliver the image to the VFX department. They send it through their pipeline, usually taking it into this linear light color space, changing whatever they need to change. Maybe someone thought, oh, the gray card is not so good in this shot, let's retouch it. So then they do this, and they give it back to you, but they transform it back to what they got. That is how it should be. If you give them an RE log C image, you should get it back as log C in terms of the color space. And then I get it back, I put it on the timeline next to the other shot, the original, and I apply my grade, and then I do a split screen and see, well, is it the same as before? If yes, great, then they understood what they need to do.
Dick, if I may,
Sure.
we can't, I mean, really important is to always kind of remember and keep in mind that we're still telling a story, and we want to want some sort of continuity in that story. And as much as you concentrate on, leading your actors through the story, making sure that the drama works and so forth, you want to have a continuity also in your image quality, and that's really important. That you don't have a moment, or as he was explaining, if the visual effects perhaps were delivered poorly, then you can't. And sometimes right in the middle of a scene, obviously. So and then you just you have all of a sudden you've got your audience is watching it, and it just kind of drops out maybe partially or just for a moment, and that's annoying. So I think that really important is to make sure that you maintain that continuity also in the look and in the grade and the feel, the texture of the colors and so forth.
And it just can happen that you can't get there because something was lost in one of the conversions. Some information in the image is lost and you can't retrieve it then in grading. So then you have to go back, have to do the VFX again, but if your deadline is like there, then you sometimes have to compromise, and that's just not what you want, to compromise your vision.
If you're doing a movie with 95% visual effects, obviously it's a little different. But
Then you do maybe
there's
something
often that.
like this and write down on like 14 pages I did for this the next Roy Andersson film, defining the pipeline, like how is the, in this case, red source material treated, how is it debayered, with what settings, and so on, what files come back from visual effects, because there are different visual effects companies involved, so you want to make sure they are all on the same page. And when it lasts for over 4 years in this case, even I have to look back at some point, what did we say, what did we agree on? So it's just a good idea to write things down, have them even, at least in an email conversation, even if it's just that small After Effects retouch that someone's doing.
In this particular case, this was written by the colorist, by Dirk, for Roy Andersson film. And you don't have to be Roy Andersson or anybody in that league to do that. But quite often, the bottleneck is the fact that visual effects work will start weeks or even months before the grading. And what happens quite often is an editor and a director will get some previews into the editing room. It looks good in the Avid, it looks good on a laptop, but then you actually go into the grading with these VFX shots, and then you only realize, probably way too late, that they look completely different, and that you have a hard time matching this. That's why I like doing this, and if I can, I do this very early on with the colorist.
So we have 2 minutes left for mastering and distribution. That's the usual production, post-production scenario, right? So we boil down the mastering part to like maybe the one most common mistake, technical mistake, when you export and transfer images, transfer frames from one system to another one. To give you again just a hands-on advice. Ever heard about this? Full legal? Who has not? Full legal range data. So within an image file, a codec, you have to decide which kind of signal range do you want to use. And there has been like different opinions about it from the broadcast times, how it should be. So now you're there with 2 options, basically. You can use the full range of these for instance, 250 shades of gray, or a somehow more limited range, like only 220 shades of gray left, for compatibility reasons. So every software that exports, but also that imports and plays back, like VLC, QuickTime Player, whatever you use to open a video file, they have to make an assumption whether within that video file, where's black? Is it actually at code value 0, or is it at 16? And this assumption is, well, based on certain common practices sometimes. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes written in a white paper by Apple that says, oh, a prose file always has to be within the limited range. Always. So to identify that again, I would normally use, can we dim the stage light a little bit so we can see the differences better? I hope so. So that's the original test file. And that is what happens, as you can see here in the shadows and in the whites, when blacks and whites are clipped, because the software just stretches out, contrasts the image more than necessary. On a real-world image, on your graded film, it might be difficult to see right away. If you have a test chart in the beginning of that, it's quite easy to spot, because that is all gone. No distinction between 0 to 16 anymore, and also here it's all done, compared to that. The other case, when it's wrong, might be more difficult, because then it's just washed out in the shadows, because shadows are lifted. It's not like really black anymore, but brighter than that, and the highlights are also lowered. But again, easier to see on a test chart than on a real-world image. I want to quickly, like very quickly, say something about your QC workflows.
Yeah, so basically, bottom line is QC is a gigantic pain in the ass, okay? I mean, everybody who's been up
QC
against...
for quality control.
Right, been up against it has realized that whatever I shoot out there, it comes back at some point and it has to be corrected. The chart, more or less, just you can see it's a bit of a messy thing, and you'll see how files travel through the facilities and then either get dumped back again, and then they travel back to the other facility who's doing the QC. At some point, you have a master that you can maybe even archive. But I think essential thing maybe that is happening these days is that we are working with a new kind of container format, the interoperable media package or format that allows us, when we do have a correction to make and re-render the file, we don't have to re-render the whole thing. We can send version files. That helps it a little bit. But still, as I said, QC is important. It's really important, especially on the production facility side, that the QC that they make is done responsibly and conscientiously before it gets passed to the second facility. This is something that happens often, that we have something created, produced, send it without really kind of having a look at it. Simple errors were made, and then the whole thing just comes back again. So if you're in a tight production timeline and have to deliver something quickly, this is where you really have to be careful.
Mm-hmm. And very, very practical down to the earth. This looks fancy, and there are QC facilities, and there are software tools that actually can pick on certain errors, like encoding errors and so on. But in the end, the best quality control, you sit there and watch it. Like the people that actually know the content. So for every feature film, of course, the DCP is checked with, ideally, the colorist, the DP, and the director. Sometimes the editor, whoever can join, the post supervisor. We really sit there and we watch the whole thing with as many pairs of eyes as possible to really spot everything. That, in that case, of course, includes sound then. So yeah, distribution. Since we're running out of time, we basically come to our most ferocious enemy or threat to our images at all. So beware here in the front rows. I'm going to open the box, but for that, again, we need to dim the lights completely, I would say. You want to assist me, guys, or you want to go and run? Careful, a bit careful.
I've had premieres where, in big cinemas, where the actors later on stage would complain about these lights, and they were absolutely right. But you can see quite clearly here what happens in a light anywhere close to the screen, what happens to the screen that used to be black.
And even if it's pointing towards the audience and not completely spilling the screen, it's obnoxious. It's like terrible. And I mean, you all know, you all have spotted it. Here it's a decent distance from the screen. This is not a real cinema. But I've certainly had scenarios with this, also with this light intensity of spilling onto the screen. So imagine your really peculiarly lit night scene. You can barely see something. Well, then you don't see anything. Okay. Let's quickly and turn on the lights again. Our conclusions. I think one of the most important things is that you try to involve the people involved in production as early as possible in terms of the image pipeline that includes, of course, a post-supervisor. If there is no post-supervisor on a production, fight for them. I think as a colorist, I'm just always so much more relieved when I know there is a post-supervisor on board. And then include DITs, colorists, everyone who touches your precious files that you gathered on set. Talk with them, talk with VFX people, and don't be afraid of saying, well, I don't know what IMF is and what we need to deliver in the end for whatever broadcast. I don't know. Please tell me. There's nothing wrong in saying you don't know. It's at least the start of a conversation, and then you also get to know how much do the others know. Because maybe they pretend to know, but they don't really know what's going on in this particular workflow scenario with these new ACES fancy stuff and OpenXR files and data and so on. I guess there's nothing to add to this.
Nope.
I hope that became very clear as well. And check your displays. There is at least a little bit of hope that within television manufacturers, you get more and more presets. There are actually something called like 709. If you find them, use them. Actually, this particular projector, I came here yesterday, of course, to check things, has a BT709 preset, and that was quite okay. Not perfect, it's not a cinema projector, but it was much better than the presentation preset that was used before. So there is a little bit of hope, and as DPs, there are ways to actually really calibrate your laptop and so on, but it takes a little bit of an effort. So we're 7 minutes over. I guess that means we won't really have, but I don't know, Katharina or anyone can tell us when we really have to rush out, or is there time for questions?
If there's nobody throwing us out, let's just continue.
Because actually we had a few more questions for you, we thought.
Yeah, and the first question definitely would be, to give you an example, a few weeks ago I walked into a production office where the producer showed me around, and he was asking me if I would work for one of his projects, and he brought me into a room that is kind of the data whatsoever room. Basically, it was several tables full of hard drives, some labeled, some not. And he said, well, this is our backups. And I said, do you know what's on there? And he said, yeah, on some of them. So question to you, what do you keep of your films? How do you store your films for maybe next week, maybe next year, maybe 10 years from now? And we can pass around the mic so we can hear you.
Anyone has a proper backup archiving strategy for yourself? Yeah? Someone? Yeah?
Yeah, we have a hard drive RAID 5.1. and simultaneous backup somewhere else stored, but also hard drives.
How long term is that? I mean, now the film has
That's a good question.
premiered, right? It was at the Berlin Festival. You had a great party and so on, and sold. So next year and in 2 years, is it still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Anybody else? I mean, you
Yeah,
can ask
there's
other
some.
questions too, of course, but
Dropbox or cloud? Okay. Oh, what is it?
Oh wow, that's a fancy mic.
I use a Dropbox or a cloud or something like this, also to put my stuff in internet because I'm afraid if someone loses their hard drive, if I lose my hard drive, they will be somewhere. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? There was someone next. You also had a question. Right?
I also have a question, but for what you asked, I try nowadays to make an ACES compliant TXR master for my work. But it really depends also on the production. I mean, if people have money to pay for an LTO, that's great. And I wanted to ask you something about like fidelity of scaling of images, which is something that you actually haven't touched on, and it's actually a really big part in which we destroy our images at the end of the process, where we start scaling things down and up for deliverables. And even in the beginning of the process, actually, some camera manufacturers don't really touch on it. But for an example, if you're making a flat project, and you're shooting 2048 pixels, then there's about 50 pixels difference, and that scaling actually only makes your image softer. And I'm not too sure why actually none of the camera manufacturers are letting you shoot in that format from the start, and you're always starting from the full container. And that's very destructive for images, and I think that people are really not aware of this process of scaling and of enlarging our images, making them smaller, and how that, like...
I would say within your frame leader, you're very welcome to define, okay, this is 1998 by 1080, this is what we're going to crop out, but your camera kind of forces you to record maybe more, so that would be okay. So you can establish a workflow where you don't have to scale. And about scaling in general, I would say the influence of the lenses that you choose is maybe more significant than the resize later in post. There are quite good like digital sharpening algorithms that can compensate for that. I would agree, in general, it's best to not touch it at all. But like in side-by-side comparisons, depending on how much you do, what the actual source resolution was, you're always, or a lot of times you're going down from something like 4K or 3K anyway to 2K. So then you kind of, doesn't matter whether you go that much or that much. When you start out from 1920 1080 in a kind of broadcast camera, and then you have to scale up to 1998, yes, that's not best case scenario. Other questions? Yeah, you had your... You throw the cube at him?
Yeah, I had a question. I read an interview with Jake Roberts, who cut Hell or High Water. And he said, when we were testing Hell or High Water, we put the same DCP on 3 different screens in the same multiplex, and each one looked completely different, none of them good. How do you protect against that?
You can't. There's no way, because, I mean, if you've got, let's say, 4,000, 10,000 in China, I don't know, 80,000 screens or something like that, everything is going to look different. It's, you know, room size, it's light, environment.
Exit signs.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's one of our big, huge problems. I mean, it fits perfectly kind of into this well-organized DCI compliancy thing, right? I mean, that's what we're all aiming for. But if the projector's got, like, I don't know, 800 hours of projection on the bulb, then obviously it's going to look crappy, you know. So that's really a hard thing. I don't think you can even really expect.
Yeah.
You know, there is new technology coming. You know, you've got your Samsung displays, these monster displays that might change it a little bit, but nobody can pay for them these days yet.
I would say a lot of it is to blame the architects of cinemas, and I'm fully up to kind of take a discussion with anyone who designed the cinema. Because it is about where the lights are, if a floor is shiny like this, or matte or dark, and some cinemas are much better than others.
If your seats are white.
If you know, well, if you take the same DCP in the different ones, then you know it's the difference of the DCP. First of all, a lot of times the situation is you come to a new cinema and you watch your film and you don't know if it's the projection or the DCP. To rule that out, again, I include my test chart sequence in the beginning, so I can say, okay, I know there's nothing wrong with the DCP, or ideally I have it checked in the post house first. But then when you're there and you know, okay, DCP is right, but it looks really crappy, then yeah, I can say that's because the walls are white, so you get a lot of bounce. The projection is too dark. The screen is a 3D silver screen, so it got a hot spot in the middle, goes darker to the edges. And then there's usually nothing you can do about it. That is like a long-term fight for the rest of my life to improve the quality in the cinemas. If you want to, I think Dolby, are they still sponsors of Berlinale? I think so. So it's it's an expensive ticket. It's also not yet available in Germany, but in some other countries, Dolby introduced Dolby Cinemas, and that's basically as good as it can get. So if you have a chance to see those, it's a cinema at its best.
Maybe we do one last question.
Lawrence, you disagree?
Well, Dolby Cinema has, of course, Dolby Cinema, of course, has its certain benefits, but also there is a definite need to sort of, in exhibiting a film, to sort of bring out the qualities of the screen. So that means if you're looking at a film, for example, A Star is Born, which is definitely not intended to have interior scenes in the car where everything is pitch black, because if you are in a real car at night, of course, you always see black detail. But to take advantage of the benefits of the screen, blacks are lowered to a point that it's not really realistic, but the screen is there. So,
okay, but in terms of the cinema design, you
cinema
could still
design is,
project a normal standard dynamic range DCP in a Dolby Cinema. You would still have pitch black walls, no exit sign, no stair lighting, a dark room. That's what I consider, just in terms of the room design, as good as
the room design is perfect, but also I think it's, especially if someone's saying we're in the multiplex and we're viewing the same DCP at 3 different screens and they look slightly different, it doesn't mean it's bad per se. There is always this thing that your eyes adapt to the color temperature of the screen you're looking at, and especially if you're looking at the same DCP. It's the same as if you're looking with 3 different types of ski goggles. Although the color is slightly different, after you wear them for 15 minutes, they will all adapt to the same tint. And most of the cinema projectors that drift will drift because of lamp aging, and that will drift color temperature, but the actual primaries of the color space will stay reasonably the same. So I'm not sure how it is here in Germany, if it's really bad, but most of the countries I watched the films on that I worked of, it's reasonably good all over. I'm actually surprised that it's quite that constant.
Well, it's definitely a lot better than it used to be, obviously. There's a little bit more control that we have.
Analog film projection.
Exactly, yeah. But and I think it's something that that when we think about distribution and what we're actually doing, I mean, we're always trying to get the top theaters, obviously. We're always trying to get the top screens, make sure that, always hearing how much have they done? Have they, updated the projectors? Have they cleaned the screen? I mean, there's sometimes, especially the silver screens, they get dusty and then they have blotches on them, even if the projection's great, there's just blotches all over the picture, and it's just, there's so many factors. And I think that, I remember grading back in the day on high-end professional displays at the vendor's place, and then saying goodbye to this beautiful image because I knew from that day on I'd never see it that good again. That's changed obviously a little bit in the home entertainment sector, and I think that the whole DCI movement is a challenge, and it's ever growing. Dolby Vision is an idea, but it's just, economically speaking, it's just not feasible.
Unfortunately, yes.
Maybe I can add as a closing word, we've all been hurt and burned by bad projection. I'm sure that is the case. And at one point when we go into distribution, unfortunately that's part of the game. But we've also all seen very good projection. And what we should do and can do is control everything we do up to the point we can, which is our master and the final DCP that we create. We cannot check every cinema, and we certainly cannot check every TV that our film will be seen on. That's a fact, but we can control what we provide for that. And that's what we should do, and we hope that we contributed to your knowledge in that regard a little bit today.
And awareness. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.